Inside one room, time itself seems trapped, yet the crime is fresh. Welcome to Fog Casebook. I am your host, Vela. Tell me your location in the comments. Your presence matters. Let's uncover it. In setting down these singular events, I am conscious of a difficulty which often besets the chronicler of my friends' exploits, the temptation to arrange them by the light of their conclusion into a neat progression which they did not at the time possess. In the moment, there were only perplexities. Afterwards, there appeared inevitabilities. Yet it was precisely the sensation of groping through a fog, of feeling one's way by touch and inference, that gave this particular adventure its peculiar savour, and which, even now, causes me to pause before I take up my pen. It was in the latter days of October, when the leaves in the parks had turned the colour of old gold, and the evenings came down early with a damp, sooty chill, that Sherlock Holmes fell into one of those moods of restless quiet which signified to my mind a drought of cases. He would lounge for hours upon the settee in our Baker Street sitting-room, his long, nervous fingers steepled before him, his eyes half closed, and yet every sense alert to the faintest stir from the street below. From time to time he would rise, pace once or twice across the room, and then return to the fire with an air of one who listens for some distant signal that refuses to come. "You are out of sorts, Holmes," said I one evening, laying down the Pall Mall Gazette. "Either your health is suffering, or you are in want of work." He opened his eyes and favoured me with one of those languid glances which implied that my conclusion was not so much incorrect as unnecessary. "My health, as you are always kind enough to remark upon, is the least interesting thing about me," said he. "As for work, the world is never in want of it. The world is only in want of someone who will look at it properly." "And yet," I returned, "we have had no visitor of consequence for 3 days." Holmes smiled faintly. "On the contrary, we have had a visitor of the greatest consequence. Only you have not observed him." I confess that I stared at him in some surprise, for I could not recall any stranger in our rooms beyond Mrs. Hudson's occasional step upon the stairs, or a passing errand boy at the door. Holmes stretched out his hand without rising, and picked from the mantelpiece a small square envelope of a bluish tint. "This," said he, "was placed beneath our door this afternoon at precisely 4:15. "I remember hearing the scrape," said I. "I supposed it to be the maid." "You supposed," returned Holmes with gentle disdain, "because you are content to let life happen to you. Now observe." He held the envelope in the firelight. There was no superscription, no address, no seal, only a clean slit at the top where it had been opened, and a single sheet of paper within. Holmes did not immediately remove it. Instead, he turned the envelope so that I could see one corner where a faint smudge appeared, as though from a thumb. "The man," said Holmes, "is right-handed. His thumb is broad, and the nail is chipped upon the outer edge. When he has handled printer's ink within the last hour, the paper was taken from a packet stored in a damp place. He is employed in a respectable trade, and he is frightened." "You draw all that from a smudge?" I cried. "From the smudge," Holmes answered, "from the texture of the paper, from the odour. You have an admirable habit, Watson, of thinking that because you do not see a thing it cannot be seen. Now," he drew out the single sheet. It was unruled, and upon it there were only a few lines written in a firm, slanting hand. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, if you value the life and reason of a man who has committed no crime, come at once, alone if you can, to number 9 Cedar Lane, Hampstead. Bring no police. Ask for Mr. Elias Hargreaves. The room where time froze is not a metaphor. Pete, a friend." Holmes read this aloud with as much composure as though it were an invitation to dinner. Yet I saw, in the quickening of his eyes, the little spark that always preceded action. "Hampstead," said he. "Cedar Lane." The room where time froze. "It is either an attempt at melodrama, or something far worse," I interrupted. Holmes's gaze softened for an instant, as it always did when my professional instincts asserted themselves. "Or something far worse," he agreed. "And as our correspondent has taken the trouble to assure us that the phrase is not a metaphor, it would be discourteous not to verify the matter." "You will not go alone," said I firmly. Holmes's mouth twitched. "My dear fellow, if I were to follow every piece of advice you have ever given me, I should be dead 10 times over and bored 100. Still, since you will certainly come if I forbid it, and since your revolver has on occasion proved a useful adjunct to my reasoning, put on your boots." It was a mark of the seriousness with which he regarded the matter that he did not once take his violin from its case, nor did he indulge in any of those airy speculations with which he often enlivened our journeys. We hailed a hansom, and in a short time were rattling northward, away from the more crowded arteries of London, into quieter roads where the lamps stood further apart, and the fog clung with a more determined malice to the hedgerows. Hampstead in those days had not yet surrendered wholly to the city. There were still lanes where trees leaned inward like conspirators, and gardens where the smell of wet earth overcame the reek of coal smoke. Cedar Lane proved to be such a place, a narrow, winding strip of road bordered by high brick walls and occasional iron gates, behind which one could glimpse dark shrubs and the pale blur of windows. Number 9 stood somewhat back from the street, a modest house of 2 stories with a small porch and a fanlight over the door. A single lamp burned in the hallway within, throwing out a dull glow upon the wet step. Holmes paid the driver and stood for a moment in the rain, his head tilted, as though the very arrangement of bricks and gutters might speak to him. "Observe," said he quietly. I followed his glance. The gravel path leading to the door showed the marks of hurried footsteps, several crossings as though someone had paced back and forth. To the left, beneath the window, the flower bed had been disturbed, like the soil turned as if by an anxious boot. Near the door, a small scrap of paper clung to the edge of the step, plastered down by the wet. Holmes stooped and lifted it delicately. It was a corner torn from a railway timetable. "King's Cross," he murmured. "Interesting." He replaced it in his pocket and rang the bell. For a moment there was no answer. Then we heard the quick patter of feet within and the sound of a chain being drawn back. The door opened a cautious inch, and a pale face appeared in the gap. A man of perhaps 45, clean-shaven, with fair hair already thinning, and eyes that were too large for his narrow cheeks. He wore a dressing gown over his clothes as though he had been unable to decide whether to go out or remain in, and his hands trembled upon the door. "Yes?" he whispered. "Mr. Elias Hargreaves?" asked Holmes.
"See, I am he. You are." "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said my friend. The effect was instantaneous. The man's shoulders sagged as though some weight had been lifted, and he pulled the door wide. "Thank God," he breathed. "Come in, sir. Come in at once." His gaze darted past Holmes to me. For a heartbeat his face tightened with displeasure. "I wrote alone." "Dr. Watson is my colleague," said Holmes smoothly. "If you have summoned me for a matter of life and reason, you may accept his presence as insurance against either being lost." Hargreaves hesitated, then gave a short, jerking nod, as one who has neither the leisure nor the courage for argument. "Very well," said he hoarsely. "But no more, no police." "We have brought none," Holmes assured him. He led us into a narrow hallway,
hung with a few watercolours of country scenes, and the usual paraphernalia of a middle-class home: umbrellas, hats upon pegs, a muddy child's boot set aside near the skirting. Yet there was an air of disorder that did not belong to the objects themselves, but to their arrangement, as though the house had recently been searched by hands that were not accustomed to searching. At the end of the passage was a sitting-room, and there, by the fire, sat a woman with a shawl about her shoulders. She rose as we entered. She was perhaps 10 years younger than Hargreaves, with dark hair drawn back severely, and a face which might have been handsome had it not been sharpened by anxiety into something almost forbidding. Her eyes, unlike her husband's, held a fierce steadiness, in the steadiness of one who has decided to fear nothing because fear has become unbearable. "This is my wife, Clara," said Hargreaves. "Clara, this is Mr. Holmes." She gave a small inclination of her head. "Mr. Holmes," said she, "if you can do what my husband believes you can, then you are welcome. If you cannot, then I pray you do not waste our time." Holmes bowed, his manner as courteous as if he had been addressed by a duchess. "Time," said he, "is precisely the commodity we are concerned with, Mrs. Hargreaves. Now, Mr. Hargreaves, tell me what has occurred." Hargreaves sank into a chair, pressing his fingertips to his temples. "It is my brother," said he, "my younger brother, Simon." "Alive?" Holmes asked. Yes, alive." Hargreaves swallowed. "At least, he breathes, he speaks, but he is not himself. And the room, Mr. Holmes, the room—" His voice broke. His wife's hand came down upon the back of his chair with a sharp, controlling pressure. "Elias," she said, "begin at the beginning. You will only confuse him." Hargreaves took a shuddering breath. "Very well," said he. "We have lived here for 5 years. I am a clerk to a firm of solicitors in Gray's Inn, Hargreaves and Merton, no relation to my employer. My brother Simon has lived with us since our mother died 2 years ago. He was a watchmaker." "A watchmaker," repeated Holmes, and I saw that his interest sharpened. "A trade of precision." "Yes, he has a small shop in Camden Town. He was quiet, steady, not given to drink, not a violent man." "And yet," said Holmes, "you wrote that he has committed no crime." Hargreaves flinched, as though Holmes had touched a bruise.
Because they will say he has," he whispered. "They will say it was his doing, but it was not." Holmes leaned back, folding his arms. "Continue," said he. "It began 3 nights ago," Hargreaves went on. "Simon came home later than usual. He was drenched, and his hands were scratched, as though he had forced his way through brambles. He carried with him a parcel wrapped in oilcloth. I asked him what it was. He said it was work. Only work." "And you believed him?" asked Holmes. I did not know what to believe. He went up to the spare room, my study, as we call it, at the top of the house. He has used it sometimes when he wished to be alone with his tools. He locked the door. Holmes's eyes flicked to the ceiling, measuring distances. "You have a study at the top, and then?" "In the night I woke," said Hargreaves,
and his voice lowering. There was a sound like the striking of many clocks at once, but muffled, as though heard through water. I thought at first I was dreaming. Clara heard it too. We both rose. It came from above, behind that locked door. Mrs. Hargreaves's expression tightened, but she did not contradict him. I called to Simon. There was no answer. I knocked. The sound ceased, and then I heard him speak. "What did he say?" Holmes asked. Hargreaves's eyes darted to his wife, and I saw in them something like shame. He said, do not open it. You will not like what you see." "And did you open it?" asked Holmes. "No, not then." Hargreaves's hands wrung together. In the morning, he came down as if nothing had happened. He ate, he drank tea, he spoke to Clara of the price of coal. Common things. Yet he did not look at either of us. His eyes kept going to the clock. "Which clock?" asked Holmes. "The one on the mantel, the one above the fire." He stared at it as though it were an enemy. Holmes glanced, almost casually, at the mantelpiece. There stood a modest brass clock under a glass dome. Its face was ordinary enough, but something in Holmes's expression told me he had registered more than its shape. "And then?" "That evening," said Hargreaves, "a man came, a stranger. He wore a long coat and a hat pulled low. He spoke with Simon in the hall. I did not hear what was said. Simon's voice was strange. He sounded as though he were repeating words he did not understand. The stranger gave him a small leather case and left." Mrs. Hargreaves's lips moved, as if she would have added something, but she remained silent.
"See, after the stranger left," Hargreaves continued, "Simon went again to the study. He locked himself in, and again, in the night, that sound, clock striking but wrong, came from above. I could not bear it. I took the poker from the hearth and went up. Clara begged me not to, but I—" "You forced the door," said Holmes. "I tried. It was locked. I struck it. The wood splintered, but the lock held, and then—" His face whitened even as he spoke, and I saw sweat upon his brow. And then the sound stopped, and there was silence so thick I could hear my own breath. I put my ear to the door. I heard ticking. Ticking. Holmes's voice was very quiet. Yes, not the sound of a single clock. Many, some fast, some slow, some irregular, as though broken. I thought I heard a voice too, but it was not Simon's voice. It was like a man speaking from a great distance. Mrs. Hargreaves shivered, though the room was warm. "And this morning?" asked Holmes. "This morning," said Hargreaves, "the door was open." He paused, and for an instant he looked like a man standing upon the edge of a cliff, unable to decide whether to jump or turn back. "I went in," he whispered, "and I saw it." Holmes did not urge him. He waited with the patience of a man who knows that the next sentence will change everything. "The room," said Hargreaves, "was wrong. The air was cold, as though no fire had ever warmed it. There were Simon's tools upon the table, laid out in neat rows. There was the parcel, opened. And upon the floor—" He choked. His wife stepped forward. "Elias," said she sharply, "speak plainly." Hargreaves swallowed hard. "Upon the floor," he repeated. "He said it was my brother. He was lying as though he had fallen. His eyes were open. He was not dead, but he did not move. And around him, Mr. Holmes, around him, everything was covered in a thin white frost." "A frost?" I exclaimed, for the notion was absurd in a heated house. "Yes," cried Hargreaves, the desperation breaking through at last. "A frost. On the chair, on the books, on the window pane, even on the ink in the bottle, as if it had tried to freeze. Yet the rest of the house was warm. Only that room was as though winter had taken it for its own." Holmes's face had assumed that expression of keen abstraction which I had come to recognize as the mask of concentrated thought. "And your brother?" said he. "What became of him?" "We carried him down," said Mrs. Hargreaves,
always speaking for the first time with a steadiness that contrasted with her husband's agitation. "He roused enough to walk between us, but he did not speak. He has been vacant since. He sits now in the kitchen, staring at nothing, and if you place a watch before him, he begins to tremble." Holmes's eyes flashed to her. "You have placed a watch before him?" "I did," she answered. Because I wished to know whether the thing had to do with his trade. It does. And the room? Asked Holmes. We have locked it again, said Hargreaves, but the frost returns. You can feel it through the door. Holmes rose to his feet. Then we shall waste no more time, said he. Dr. Watson and I will see this room where time froze. Hargreaves sprang up, gripping Holmes's sleeve with a sudden, almost childish desperation. Mr. Holmes, he whispered.
You must understand, if the police come, if anyone comes, Simon will be ruined. They will say he has done something wicked. They will take him away. And it was not his doing. Holmes looked down at the trembling hand and gently disengaged himself. Your brother's reputation, said he, is a lesser matter than your brother's life and mind. But do not fear. Scotland Yard will not come until I choose to summon them. Now, show me the way. We ascended the stairs, past the narrow landings and the closed doors of bedrooms, until we reached the top floor where the ceiling sloped slightly under the roof. There, at the end of a short passage, stood a plain wooden door. It looked no different from any other, and yet as I approached I felt, with an instinct which I could not explain, a chill that was not of the air, but of the imagination.
But Holmes knelt at once, placing his palm lightly upon the wood. Cold, he murmured, very cold. He bent his head, and for several seconds he listened. Well, I asked. He did not answer immediately. His eyes, half closed, were intent upon some faint sensation that escaped me. Then he rose and turned to Hargreaves. Has anyone entered since you locked it? No, on my honour. Has anyone tampered with the lock? The key? The key is here. Hargreaves produced it from his pocket with shaking fingers. It was a simple brass key, worn smooth by use. Holmes examined it, or then the lock, then the crack beneath the door. A draught, said I, for I felt a thin line of cold air brushing my boot. Holmes's lip curled. A draught does not carry frost in October, said he, nor does it make men babble like infants. Open it. Hargreaves inserted the key, but for a moment it resisted, and I saw him strain. Then it turned with a click that sounded, in the hush of the passage, as loud as a pistol shot. He pulled the door open. A wave of cold air rolled out upon us, so sharp and sudden that I involuntarily drew back. My breath smoked faintly. The passage, which a moment before had been merely chilly, now felt like the threshold of an ice-house. Holmes stepped forward at once, his eyes bright. The room beyond was small, perhaps 12 feet by 10, with a sloping ceiling and a single window that looked out over dark gardens. A writing table stood beneath it, littered with small tools and brass fragments. Shelves lined one wall, holding books and boxes. A chair lay overturned near the centre, and upon every surface there was indeed a thin glittering film, like the first touch of winter upon a pond. Oh, but it was not the frost that held me. It was the clock. Upon the mantelpiece, there was a mantelpiece in the room, though no fire burned there, stood a large, ornate clock in a wooden case, unlike any I had seen in the house below. Its face was ivory, marked with Roman numerals. Its hands were stopped at 20 minutes past 2. Holmes moved toward it with the caution of a man approaching a wild animal. "Do not touch anything," he said sharply, and for the first time there was an edge in his voice which told me that something here had pricked even his composure. I obeyed, though my eyes ranged wildly over the room. On the table was an open oilcloth parcel. Within it lay a curious apparatus of brass and steel, gears, springs, and a coiled band of metal, half clockwork, half something else. Beside it was a leather case, eye open and empty, as though it had once held a delicate instrument. On the floor near the overturned chair there were dark marks, as if someone had scraped the boards with a boot heel. Holmes had knelt before the clock. He did not open it, but he studied the wood, the face, the hands, and the glass over it with an intensity that made the object seem alive beneath his gaze. 20 minutes past 2, I murmured, before I could stop myself. Is that when? Holmes held up a finger for silence. He leaned close and I saw his nostrils flare. Then very slowly he drew from his pocket a small lens and examined the edge of the clock's glass. For perhaps half a minute he remained so, motionless, and then he straightened with the air of a man who has found the first thread of a knot. Said he softly. What is it? I asked. Holmes's eyes were still upon the clock, but his voice came as if from a great distance. Time, said he, has not frozen here, Watson. It has been stolen. At that instant, as though in answer to his words, there came from somewhere within the clock a faint sound, so faint that I would have thought it imagination had Holmes not stiffened. It was a ticking, not steady, not regular, but a tick, pause, tick, tick, pause, tick, as if some hidden mechanism struggled to remember the rhythm it had been built to obey. Hargreaves let out a strangled cry behind us. Do you hear it? He whispered. It's beginning again. Holmes turned his head, and for the briefest moment his eyes met mine with an expression I had never before seen there, not fear, not doubt, but a sharpened excitement, like a hunter who has found tracks of an unknown beast. Yes, said he, it is beginning again. And now, Mr. Hargreaves, you will do exactly as I say. You will go downstairs. You will keep your brother away from the staircase. You will allow no one to leave the house, and you will tell your wife to make strong tea. Hargreaves stared. Tea? He repeated stupidly. Yes, said Holmes with a flash of impatience. Tea, for you, for her, for Dr. Watson, if he will take it. And if you have brandy, bring it also. We may require our nerves. He stepped further into the room, his long fingers hovering in the air, not touching, as though he could feel the shape of the mystery without contact. Watson, said he quietly, stand by the door. Watch the passage. If anyone comes up, stop them. And whatever happens in this room, whatever you may hear, do not move until I tell you. There was something in his tone which made my heart beat faster. I took my place by the door, my hand instinctively straying toward my revolver. Holmes, meanwhile, moved to the table and stared down at the brass apparatus within the oilcloth as though it were a patient upon an operating table. The frost upon it glittered faintly. The stopped clock upon the mantelpiece ticked irregularly in the silence, like a heart that had forgotten how to beat. And then, very slowly, the minute hand gave a minute, trembling jerk forward. Only a hair's breadth. Only enough to make my skin prickle. Holmes did not look up, but I heard him draw in his breath. Ah, he murmured, so it can move. Outside the window, the fog pressed its pale face against the pane. Behind us, and from somewhere below, there came the faint clink of cups and the murmur of hurried voices. Within the room where time froze, the clock began to tick. Holmes remained bent over the table, his face so near the brasswork that the frost upon it seemed to gleam against his cheek. The irregular ticking behind him had gained confidence, like a timid speaker finding his words. It was still not the steady pulse of a well-made clock. Rather, it was a stuttering insistence, as though the mechanism were being urged forward by fits and starts of some hidden power. For my own part, I kept my station by the door as he had commanded. The The chill that issued from the room crept beneath my collar and into my bones, and yet my mind was far more disturbed by the sight of that minute hand which had visibly advanced. And I had seen many strange things in my association with Holmes, tricks of poison, cunning devices, the peculiarities of man's depravity, yet there was something peculiarly unsettling in any suggestion that time itself might be tampered with, like a common lock. Holmes at last straightened, and without turning, held out his hand. "Matches, Watson?" I passed them to him. He took one, struck it, and held the flame beneath the brass apparatus, not so close as to scorch it, but enough to soften the delicate frost. Where the ice retreated, the metal showed itself in the lamplight, cogwheels cut with exquisite fineness, a spiral spring of bluish steel, and a little cage-like chamber at the centre, as if meant to house something fragile. He let the match burn down to his fingers, shook it out, and then took a second, warming a different portion. "I listen," said he. I listened. The ticking had altered again, still irregular, but now with a faint overlay, a whispering tremor that seemed almost like the hum of a wire held near the ear. "What am I to hear?" I asked. "The absence of something," Holmes replied. "This is not merely a clock, Watson. It is a machine whose purpose is to keep two measures together. When one stumbles, the other stumbles with it." He moved to the mantel and, with infinite care, examined the stopped hands without touching them. Then with his lens he studied the rim of the glass again, the edge of the wood, and the narrow seam where the case joined its back. "A workman's hand," he murmured, "but not English. Too neat for Birmingham, too bold for Clerkenwell. You can tell that by looking at the seam?" I could not keep the incredulity from my voice. Of Holmes gave the faintest smile. "You can tell by looking at a man's sleeve whether he has been to the Strand or to the river. Why should you not tell by looking at a clock whether it has been to London or to the Continent? See here, this varnish, French, and here this tiny scratch upon the brass screw head. The tool that made it was narrow and tapered, a continental screwdriver. Now the more interesting question is how it came into Simon Hargreaves's possession." At that moment a soft step sounded in the passage beyond, and Mrs. Hargreaves appeared at the doorway, carrying a tray with 2 cups and a decanter of brandy. Even she, composed as she had been below, paused at the threshold as the breath of cold met her. Her eyes flicked to the frost, to the overturned chair, and finally to the ornate clock with a look that was almost hatred. I brought what you asked for," she said, "and I have done as you instructed. Elias is with Simon in the kitchen." Holmes accepted the tray without thanks, not from rudeness, but from that complete absorption which made courtesy, for the moment, irrelevant. "Excellent," said he. "Set it there. No, not on the table. The chair." She obeyed, placing the tray upon the upturned chair leg with an uncertain hand. "Mrs. Hargreaves," Holmes went on, "you have kept something back." Her chin lifted. "I have told you what is necessary." Holmes's eyes remained upon the apparatus, but his words came swift and sure. "You have omitted the most human part of the matter. Your husband speaks of sounds and frost as a man speaks of ghosts, poorly and with fear. You speak of them as a woman speaks of fire, dangerous, but not miraculous. You've been upstairs yourself before this morning." Her colour rose, but she did not look away. "Yes," she said. "I have." "When?" asked Holmes. "Last night," she answered. "After Elias failed to break the lock, he went back to bed, shaking like a child. I could not. I waited until he slept, and then I came up with the key." Holmes's head turned at last, and his gaze fixed upon her with a sharpness that made her seem suddenly very small in that icy room. "You entered?" "I did." "And you saw your brother-in-law?" I saw him through the crack of the door at first. He was on the floor then already. I pushed the door open a little and I felt the cold. It was like opening an oven, only it was the opposite. Her voice tightened, but she forced it on. I went in. I touched his shoulder. He was alive. His skin was cold, but not like a dead man's, more like something taken from a cellar. And the clock? Holmes asked very softly. Her eyes went to the mantel. It was there, she said. It was ticking then, worse than now. And the hands... She hesitated. Yes, Holmes pressed. The hands were moving backward, she said, and there was a tremor now in her steady voice. I saw it. I saw the minute hand slip the wrong way, as if the clock were remembering another hour. In spite of myself, I felt a tightening in my throat. It is one thing to hear of oddities. It is another to have them described with the plain certainty of a witness. Holmes, however, showed no astonishment. Only a deeper intentness came into his face, as if the last piece of a design had been set into place. "And you did not tell your husband?" said he. "No," she answered, almost fiercely, "because he would have run for the police in the morning, and Simon would have been taken for a madman. He is a good man. He has never harmed anyone. If he has been harmed, then it is for us to protect him first." Holmes nodded once, as if acknowledging not the morality but the usefulness of her decision. "You did one foolish thing, however," said he. Her eyes narrowed. "What?" "You touched him," Holmes replied. "And you opened the room. That accounts for the disturbed soil beneath the window. You went out into the garden." Mrs. Hargreaves stiffened. "You are making guesses." "I am making deductions," Holmes said coolly. "There is fresh earth upon the heel of your boot, and a smear of clay upon the hem of your skirt, which is not of this room. Furthermore, you smell faintly of boxwood. There is boxwood in your garden below that window. You went out to look for something, or to hide something." A silence fell so complete that the ticking seemed to swell in it. Mrs. Hargreaves's hands clenched at her sides. "I went out," she admitted at last, in a low voice. I thought if there was some wickedness, it might have been brought in. I looked beneath the window. I saw where the soil had been scuffed. I dug only a little." "And what did you find?" Holmes asked. Her breath came quick. "Nothing," she said. Holmes's gaze held her for a long moment, and then he looked away as though he had set her aside like a doubtful witness. "Very well," said he. "Then we shall dig again with more intelligence." He turned abruptly to me. "Watson, taste the air." I did so, feeling ridiculous and yet obeying as I always had. When the cold had a dry, metallic tang to it, like iron filings. "It is sharp," I said, like a chemist's shop. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Exactly," said he. "Not winter, but chemistry. Frost can be made in October, Watson, and made very swiftly if one knows how. The question is, why make it here, and why bind it to a clock?" He took up the brandy decanter, sniffed it, and set it down untouched. "No," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "Not drink, not yet." Then, with a sudden quick movement, he drew his handkerchief from his pocket and held it near the seam of the clock's case. The fabric fluttered faintly, as if drawn by a tiny breath. "A vent," said Holmes, "and if there is a vent, there is a reservoir." He glanced at the window. Frost rimmed the pane. But through it I could still see the dark blur of the garden and the glistening line of the wall. "Mrs. Hargreaves," said he, "did you see any glass on the floor last night?" "No." Holmes nodded, as though confirming something already known. "And you, Watson, look here." He pointed to the boards near the overturned chair, to the dark marks I had noticed. Not a struggle, Not dragging. Those are circular scuffs. A man turning upon his heel, back and forth, as if unable to decide whether to flee or to approach. Fear, not violence. The ticking behind him suddenly steadied for 3 beats. Tick, 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 and then faltered again, like a heart missing its rhythm. At the same instant, the minute hand gave another tiny jerk forward. Holmes's head snapped up. "Something has been triggered," he said.
"Is not by us alone?" He crossed to the door in 2 long strides. "Watson, down to the kitchen," said he. "At once. I wish to see Simon Hargreaves as he is now, before whatever is happening upstairs finishes happening." I started to obey, but even as I moved, a sharp, muffled sound came from below, an exclamation, half cry and half gasp, followed by the crash of something dropped. Holmes's eyes hardened. "That," said he, "will be Simon?" Holmes was already halfway down the stairs before I had fully grasped the meaning of the sound. I followed close upon his heels, the cold of the upper room giving way with startling abruptness to the ordinary warmth of the house. The contrast itself seemed to jar the senses, as though one passed not merely from floor to floor, but from one condition of reality to another.
We reached the kitchen to find Elias Hargreaves standing rigid by the table, his face ashen, his hands spread upon the wood as though to steady himself. At his feet lay a shattered teacup, its fragments scattered across the tiles, the tea soaking into the grout like a dark stain. In the corner, upon a straight-backed chair, sat Simon Hargreaves. He was a man of slighter build than his brother, with the same fair hair, but a gentler cast of feature. At that moment, however, gentleness had deserted him entirely. His body was hunched forward, his hands clenched upon his knees, and his eyes, wide, unfocused and glistening, were fixed upon something that only he could see. His lips moved silently, forming words without sound. Holmes went to him at once and knelt, placing himself squarely in Simon's line of vision. "Simon," he said, all quietly but firmly, "look at me." There was no response. Holmes did not repeat himself. Instead, he took from his pocket a plain silver watch, his own, and held it up so that it caught the light from the kitchen lamp. Simon's reaction was instantaneous and violent. He recoiled with a sharp cry, his chair scraping against the wall. His hands flew up to shield his face, and from his throat came a sound that was not quite human, an inarticulate gasp of terror. "Take it away!" he cried hoarsely. "Don't let it touch me! Don't let it go back!" Holmes withdrew the watch at once, slipping it back into his pocket. "Enough," he said. "You see, Mr. Hargreaves, your brother is not mad. He is frightened, and with reason." Elias sank into a chair opposite, burying his face in his hands. "It's getting worse," he murmured. "Every hour it's worse." Holmes placed a hand briefly on Simon's shoulder. The younger man flinched but did not pull away. His skin, I noticed, was cool beneath the fingers, not clammy but unnaturally cold, as though his blood moved reluctantly through his veins. "Simon," Holmes said again more gently now, "I am not your enemy. I am here to stop what is happening to you. But I must ask you some questions, and you must answer me as best you can. Will you try?" For a moment there was no sign that Simon had even heard him. Then slowly the rigid tension eased from his frame. His hands dropped back to his knees. He drew a long, shuddering breath. "I didn't mean to," he whispered. "I only wanted to see if it could be done." Holmes's eyes flicked to mine, honour light, with that keen satisfaction which always attended the first clear statement of motive. "What," he asked, "did you want to see could be done?" Simon swallowed. "They said it was impossible," he said. "That time only goes one way, but that's only because people build their clocks to behave. If you change the rules, if you force the mechanism to listen to something else— "Simon," Elias broke in, his voice cracking, "for God's sake, what have you done?" Simon looked at his brother then, and for an instant the old affection shone through the terror. "I was trying to fix a mistake," he said simply. Holmes leaned back upon his heels. "A mistake," he repeated. "Whose?" Simon hesitated, and his gaze slid away. "Mine," he said, "and someone else's." Holmes did not press him immediately. Instead, he turned to Elias.
Who knew of your brother's work?" he asked. "Who visited him at his shop?" Elias frowned, thinking. "Customers," he said. "Collectors sometimes. There was one man, foreign I think, who came often in the last few months. He spoke with an accent, German perhaps, or Austrian." Holmes nodded. "And he brought the leather case," said Holmes. "The stranger you mentioned. That was not the first time he had appeared." "No," Elias admitted. "Simon said he was a scholar, a man who studied timepieces, not for use but for theory." Simon gave a weak, bitter laugh. "He studied more than that," he said. "He studied impatience." Holmes turned back to him at once. "His name?" he asked. Simon shook his head. "He never gave it. He said names were imprecise, that they clung to the wrong moments." Holmes's lips thinned. "And he offered you a theory," he said. And then an apparatus." "Yes," Simon whispered. "He said that if two clocks could be bound, one to the other, then one could be made to correct the second, to pull it back if it ran too far ahead, or to hold it still if it rushed towards something it should not reach." "And the price?" Holmes asked quietly. Simon's fingers tightened upon his knees. "He said the price would only be paid if I failed." Holmes rose smoothly to his feet. "Which you have," said he. Simon looked up sharply. "I didn't mean to," he repeated desperately. "The first night it worked. I heard it, felt it. The clock upstairs, it slowed, it listened, and for a moment everything was quiet, as if the house itself were holding its breath." "And then?" Holmes prompted. "And then," Simon said, his voice trembling, "it tried to catch up." A silence fell upon the kitchen.
Somewhere above us, faint but unmistakable, came the irregular ticking again, filtering down through the floors like the echo of a troubled heart. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, as though measuring the sound against some internal scale. "The mechanism is seeking equilibrium," he said, "and it will not find it while you are here." Elias stared at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Holmes replied, "that your brother has been made the counterweight. The clock upstairs is not merely bound to another clock, it is bound to Simon himself. His pulse, his temperature, his perception of time." Mrs. Hargreaves, who had entered quietly and now stood by the door, uttered a sharp intake of breath. "You mean it is killing him?" she said. Holmes met her gaze steadily. "I mean it will," he said, "unless it is stopped." Simon let out a low moan and bent forward again, his hands flying to his temples. "It's pulling," he gasped. "I can feel it pulling, like being dragged backward through mud." Holmes moved instantly. "Watson," he said, "stay with him. Keep him warm. Do not let him sleep." I placed my coat around Simon's shoulders and took his cold hands in mine, rubbing them briskly. His skin felt almost feverishly cold, as though heat fled from him rather than gathering. Holmes turned to Elias. "I require tools," he said. "A hammer, a chisel, anything that will open the case of that clock without shattering the mechanism inside." Elias sprang up at once and hurried toward the hall cupboard. "And you, Mrs. Hargreaves," Holmes went on, "you will come with me. If there is a reservoir buried beneath that window—" "Because I must see it before the system completes its cycle."
The cycle? She asked. Holmes was already moving toward the stairs. Yes, he said grimly, when the clock decides which moment it prefers. Above us, the ticking suddenly grew louder, more confident, until for 3 beats it sounded almost normal. Tick, tick, tick. Simon cried out sharply in my arms, his body convulsing. Holmes did not look back. "Hold him, Watson," he said. "We are running out of time." I held Simon as his spasm passed, feeling the rigid tremor run through his frame and then ebb, leaving him panting like a man hauled from deep water. His eyes rolled toward the ceiling, following, it seemed, the invisible tug of that infernal mechanism above. I tightened my grip and forced my voice into steadiness. "Look at me, Simon," I said. "Breathe slowly. When you are here, in the kitchen, you are safe." He clutched at my sleeve with surprising strength. "It's counting," he whispered. "It counts the spaces between things. It counts the seconds I don't live." "Nonsense," I said, though the words tasted thin. "It is only a machine." He gave a broken laugh that turned into a cough. "That's what I thought," he said. "Only a machine. And yet, when it listens, everything listens with it." Footsteps thudded upon the stairs. Holmes returned, moving with the quick certainty of a man who has chosen his route. Behind him came Mrs. Hargreaves, her shawl drawn tight, her face set. Elias followed, burdened with a small assortment of tools, a carpenter's hammer, a broad chisel, and a pair of pliers, clutched in both hands as though they were weapons. Holmes did not pause to reassure any of us.
And his eyes went straight to Simon, and his gaze sharpened at the sight of the man's pallor. "How long since the last seizure?" he asked. "Seconds," I answered. "It came with the stronger ticking." Holmes nodded once, as though fitting a cog into place. "Then the coupling is tightening," said he. "The machine is drawing a line, and your brother is being forced to follow it." Elias made a sound like a sob. "For God's sake, Holmes, what is it? Witchcraft?" Holmes's mouth tightened with impatience. "Chemistry and mechanics," he snapped. "Witchcraft is merely what the ignorant call method. Now, Mrs. Hargreaves, what did you dig up last night?" Her eyes flashed. "I told you, nothing." Holmes's gaze did not waver. "You dug in the wrong place," said he, "and you stopped when you heard something." She hesitated. And for the first time, I saw her composure crack. "I heard a click," she admitted reluctantly. "Like a latch. I thought it might be a trap. I covered the soil again." Holmes's expression softened by a fraction, not pity, but approval of a fact confirmed. "Good," said he. "That click was real. It means there is something buried there which is not natural to a flower bed." He turned to Elias. "You will take Dr. Watson's place," said he. "Hold Simon. Keep him sitting. If he loses consciousness, tilt his head forward and keep his airway clear." Elias looked helplessly at me. I can't." "You can," said Holmes coldly, "because if you do not, you may watch your brother die while you stand empty-handed." That, harsh as it was, had its effect. Elias set down the tools upon the table and went to Simon with shaking hands. Simon, half delirious, I stared at his brother as if seeing him through a mist. "Elias," he whispered, "don't let it choose." Elias gathered him close. "I won't," he said hoarsely. "I won't." Holmes picked up the hammer and chisel and gestured to me. "Come, Watson," said he. "We require steadier hands than these upstairs. And you, Mrs. Hargreaves, bring the candle. We may find ourselves in a very dark place." We went up again, 2 steps at a time. The house seemed unnaturally silent now, as if every ordinary creak and settling beam had been subdued by the cold presence above. Even the air upon the stair felt changed, thinner, tinged with that same metallic sharpness that had struck me in the room. The ticking grew louder with each step, until by the time we reached the top landing, it was no longer a faint irregularity, but a distinct, insistent clatter, hard like many insects tapping behind a wall. The door to the study was still ajar from our previous entry. Frost had spread further. The very hinges glittered. Holmes halted at the threshold and held his hand out, palm down, as if testing the air for heat. "Lower," he murmured. "It is drawing more." He stepped inside, and I followed, my breath whitening. Mrs. Hargreaves came last, the candle flame in her hand burning with an oddly steady yellow light, as though the air here had less life in it to disturb it. The ornate clock upon the mantelpiece was now ticking with a dreadful confidence. Tick, 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 never regular, never settling, yet always pressing forward. The minute hand had advanced perceptibly since we had left. It now hovered closer to the half-hour. 20 minutes past 2, I muttered. "And now nearer 2:30. Holmes did not answer. He went straight to the clock and, with the careful economy of movement of a surgeon, placed the chisel at the seam of the wooden case. "We shall open it without breaking the glass," said he. "If we smash it, whatever is contained may escape, and I have no desire to release a chemical refrigerant into a confined space while we are in it." "A refrigerant," I repeated. "Ammonia or ether, perhaps a mixture," he said. "Something that evaporates rapidly and steals heat from the surroundings. The frost is not supernatural, Watson, it is merely fast. What concerns me is not the cold, but the timing of it." He tapped gently with the hammer. The chisel bit into the seam. He worked around the case in small increments, loosening it as a man loosens a stubborn lid. Mrs. Hargreaves watched, her eyes fixed upon Holmes's hands. "You speak as though this were a trick," she said. "But my brother-in-law, what of him? Is his terror a trick as well?" Holmes did not glance up. "Terror," said he, "is the most reliable of all reactions because it cannot be reasoned into a man. It must be earned. Your brother-in-law has earned it. That is why we must discover who is paying him." A sharp crack sounded as the case gave slightly. Holmes paused, listening. The ticking continued, but beneath it I thought I heard, very faint, that other sound again, the whispering hum like a wire under tension. "There," said Holmes, and his voice dropped. "Do you hear? The oscillator?" He slid his fingers into the narrow gap and prized gently. The wooden case opened like a door upon tiny hinges, revealing the interior of the clock. But what lay within was no ordinary arrangement of weights and gears. There were gears, certainly, fine brass wheels turning with the steady inevitability of a well-made timepiece, but they were crossed and complicated by additional components. A small glass ampule set in a metal cradle, thin copper tubing coiled like a serpent, and, most remarkable of all, a second balance mechanism mounted beside the first, its spring vibrating in a nervous blur. Holmes's eyes glittered in the candlelight. "Two hearts," he murmured, "and one is foreign to the body." He leaned closer, careful not to disturb anything. With his lens he examined the ampule. A faint mist swirled within it, as though the liquid inside were boiling without heat. "See," he said to me, "a volatile compound. It is being released in minute quantities."
Regulated by that secondary balance. Each release chills the room. Each chill slows the primary mechanism, and when it slows, the secondary seeks to correct it by forcing it to catch up. "And Simon?" I asked, my voice low. Holmes's jaw tightened. "The secondary balance is not responding only to the clock," he said. "It is responding to something else, a living rhythm. Your pulse, mine, the house's vibrations, any of those might affect it a fraction. But Simon's is tied to it. He has been made part of the regulation. Mrs. Hargreaves gripped the candle so tightly that wax dripped upon her fingers. She did not seem to notice. "How?" she whispered. "How could a man be tied to a clock?" Holmes's gaze shifted from the mechanism to the table, to the oilcloth parcel and the brass apparatus within. "Through what he built," said he.
All through what he touched. The apparatus on the table is a coupling device, a transmitter of impulse, not electrical in the modern sense, but mechanical and acoustic. It listens and it answers. If it were tuned to a man's rhythm, his breath, his heartbeat, then the clock would, in effect, become a parasite upon him. He straightened abruptly, his face tense. "And parasites," said he, "do not relinquish their host willingly." At that instant, the ticking lurched into a frantic rush, tick, 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 so fast that it became almost a rattle. The second balance inside the clock blurred wildly, vibrating as if on the verge of tearing itself apart. The mist in the ampule thickened, and a new bloom of frost sprang across the interior glass like a spreading fern. Holmes snapped the case half shut, not closing it fully, but shielding it.
Downstairs," he said sharply. "Now!" We were at the door when a sound rose from below, Elias's voice, raw and shouting my name. "Doctor, he's gone limp. Watson, he's—" Holmes's face went hard as flint. "It has begun to choose," he said, "and we must reach him before it decides." We took the stairs at a run. Holmes was ahead of me, his long stride eating the steps two at a time, the hammer still clenched in his hand like an extension of his will. The ticking pursued us, no longer confined to the upper room, but echoing through the house itself, as though the walls had learned the rhythm and were eager to repeat it. We burst into the kitchen to find Elias half rising from his chair, Simon's weight sagging heavily in his arms. Simon's head lolled forward, his mouth slack, his breath coming in shallow, irregular pulls.
His skin had lost even its former pallor, and taken on a faint bluish cast that made my medical instincts flare with alarm. I was beside him in an instant, easing him back into the chair and tilting his head as Holmes had instructed. I pressed my fingers to his wrist. "Pulse," I said, "weak but present." "How weak?" Holmes demanded. "Too weak," I answered, "and irregular." Holmes's eyes flicked to the clock on the kitchen mantel. Its modest brass face still ticked steadily, indifferent to the chaos upstairs. He crossed to it and stared, not at the hands, but at the case itself, as though listening for something beneath the ordinary sound. "Good," he murmured. "It has not yet been recruited." Mrs. Hargreaves hovered near the doorway, her face white, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles stood out like chalk.
"Can you help him?" she whispered. "Yes," Holmes said curtly, "but not here. Watson, can he stand?" "Barely," I replied. "But with support, yes." "Then we move him," said Holmes. "Now!" Elias stared at him in horror. "Move him upstairs into that room?" "Into the room," Holmes repeated with a force that brooked no argument. "The connection must be confronted at its source. If we leave him here, the clock will continue to draw from him until there is nothing left to take." I hesitated only a moment, weighing instinct against reason, and then nodded. "He's right," I said quietly to Elias. "We have no other chance." Between us, we lifted Simon. He groaned faintly as we raised him, his eyelids fluttering without opening. The chill of his body seeped through my sleeves. Each step toward the stairs felt like a violation of common sense.
And yet, every second we delayed felt worse. The ascent was a nightmare of strained muscles and labored breath. With each step, the air grew colder, the ticking louder. By the time we reached the top landing, Simon's breathing had become so shallow that I feared it would stop altogether. Holmes flung the study door wide. "Lay him there," he commanded, pointing to the centre of the room. The frost upon the floor crackled faintly beneath our boots as we lowered Simon onto a rug Holmes had kicked aside. His body looked grotesquely out of place in that frozen chamber, like a living thing set down in a tomb. At once, the clock responded. The frantic ticking faltered, then surged again, louder than before, and the minute hand leapt forward a full notch. The second balance inside the open case shuddered violently.
Its spring vibrating so fast that it became a blur. Simon cried out, a thin tearing sound, and arched his back as though a current had passed through him. "Hold him!" Holmes snapped. I knelt at Simon's head, bracing his shoulders, while Elias clutched his legs with desperate strength. Mrs. Hargreaves stood rigid by the door, her eyes fixed upon her brother-in-law, her lips moving soundlessly. Holmes had already turned back to the clock. He set the hammer and chisel aside and reached instead for the brass apparatus on the table. With quick, precise movements, he assembled it, fitting the gears and springs together as though continuing a task he had only momentarily set down. "You built this to listen, Simon," he said, not looking at the man, but pitching his voice so that it carried. To hear the difference between what is and what might have been, but you did not build it to choose." Simon gasped, his eyes flickering open for a heartbeat. "It listens too well," he whispered. "Yes," said Holmes, "that is always the danger with clever things." He lifted the completed apparatus and held it close to the open clock case. At once the erratic ticking altered, hesitating, then falling into a strange, syncopated rhythm, as though confused by a familiar but unwelcome voice. Holmes smiled thinly. "It recognizes its sibling," he said. "Good." He adjusted a small screw upon the apparatus, turning it by minute degrees. Each adjustment was answered by a change in the clock's behavior, a brief acceleration, a stutter, a pause so long that my heart lurched in my chest. "What are you doing?" I demanded.
Oh, as Simon convulsed again beneath my hands. "I am lying," Holmes replied calmly. "I am feeding it a rhythm that does not exist." He bent close, his ear near the apparatus, listening as intently as Simon might once have listened to the subtleties of a watch. "The secondary balance seeks harmony," Holmes went on. "It cannot abide contradiction. If it hears two equally strong signals, it will attempt to reconcile them by weakening both." Mrs. Hargreaves gave a sharp cry. "You are tearing it apart." "Not tearing," Holmes corrected. "Confusing." The frost thickened suddenly, spreading in a rapid bloom across the floor and climbing the legs of the table. The mist in the ampule inside the clock churned violently, as though boiling in panic. The ticking became a furious clatter, then broke apart into a series of uneven clicks. Simon's body went slack. For a dreadful instant I thought he had died. I pressed my ear to his chest. There, faint but unmistakable, was his heartbeat. "Holmes!" I shouted. "He's fading!" Holmes did not look away from his work. "Good," he said. "Then it is losing its grip." With a sudden, decisive movement, he struck the apparatus with the hammer. Not a wild blow, but a precise one, aimed at a particular joint. There was a sharp, metallic crack, and the assembled gears flew apart, skittering across the frozen boards. At once the clock screamed. I can describe it no other way. The ticking rose into a high, keening whine, like a kettle left too long upon the fire, and then cut off abruptly. The second balance snapped, its spring unwinding in a blur of silver. The mist in the ampule condensed instantly, frosting the glass opaque, and the room fell into silence. Not the tense, expectant silence of before, but a heavy, dead quiet, as though a great breath had been expelled and not yet drawn again. I felt it before I saw it. Warmth. The cold retreated in a rush, the frost melting into damp patches upon the floor. My breath ceased to smoke. Simon stirred. His eyes opened fully now, and for the first time there was recognition in them. "Elias," he murmured. Elias sobbed aloud and gathered him up, heedless of everything else. Holmes stood very still by the mantelpiece, his eyes upon the ruined clock. At last he reached out and stopped the hands himself, pressing them gently until they lay motionless. 20 minutes past 2, he said softly. "That is where it ends." Mrs. Hargreaves sank into a chair, trembling. "Is it over?" she asked. Holmes turned, and though his face was pale, there was a quiet satisfaction in his eyes. "For the clock," said he, "yes. As for the man who brought it, no. He will wish to know why his experiment failed." He glanced at the window, beyond which the garden lay dark and sodden. "And when he comes," Holmes added, "we shall be ready for him." The house did not return at once to its former self. Even as the warmth spread and the last traces of frost melted into darkened patches upon the boards, there lingered an oppressive stillness, as though the walls themselves waited to see whether the reprieve would last. Simon slept now, a deep, exhausted sleep, born not of weakness but of release. I remained with him for a time, watching the colour return to his cheeks and the rhythm of his breathing settle into something reassuringly human. Holmes, meanwhile, I wasted no moment in sentiment. He moved about the room with renewed energy, examining the shattered remains of the apparatus and the clock's interior with the cool detachment of a man reviewing a concluded experiment. "It is done," he said at last, more to himself than to us. "The coupling is broken. The secondary balance cannot be repaired without rebuilding the entire system, and the compound has exhausted itself." Elias looked up from his brother, his face lined with fatigue and relief. "Then Simon will be himself again?" "In time," Holmes replied. "The body forgives more readily than the mind, but your brother has an advantage. He understands what was done to him. Understanding robs fear of its sharpest edge." Mrs. Hargreaves rose slowly from her chair. "You spoke of a man who would come," she said.
"The one who brought the clock." Holmes nodded. "He has invested too much in this contrivance to abandon it quietly. A man who believes he has bent time to his will is not inclined to accept failure as final." As if summoned by his words, a faint crunch sounded from below, the unmistakable tread of a foot upon gravel. Holmes moved at once to the window and peered down into the garden. I followed his gaze and saw a dark figure standing near the disturbed earth beneath the study window. The man was tall, spare, and wrapped in a long coat, his hat brim pulled low against the damp night air. In his hand he held a small lantern, the light of which glinted off something metallic at his feet. Holmes smiled thinly. "Punctual," said he, "always a reassuring quality in a criminal." He turned to Elias. "You will remain here," he said. "Both of you."
"Watson and I will attend to our visitor." We descended quietly, our steps muffled by the lingering hush of the house. Holmes took a lamp from the hall and opened the front door without ceremony. "Good evening," he called out. The man in the garden stiffened, then straightened slowly, as though composing himself before turning. His face, when the lantern light struck it, was narrow and intellectual, with high cheekbones and eyes that glittered with quick intelligence. There was no surprise in them, only irritation. "You are earlier than I expected," he said, in careful English touched unmistakably with a German accent. "You are later," Holmes replied, "and you have lost your property." The man's gaze flicked past Holmes toward the darkened house. "Then it is finished," he said. "A pity. It was progressing beautifully." "You call nearly killing a man beautiful?" I demanded. He regarded me with mild curiosity. "Collateral instability," he said. "Unfortunate, but instructive." Holmes stepped aside, gesturing toward the open door. "You may as well come in," he said. "The conversation will be more comfortable." To my astonishment, the man obeyed. He extinguished his lantern, set it neatly upon the step, and entered as though invited to tea. "My name," he said, removing his hat, "is Professor Carl Weiss. I suppose you are Mr. Sherlock Holmes." "I am," said Holmes. "And you are under arrest." Weiss smiled faintly. "By whom?" he asked. Holmes's eyes never left his. "By reason," he said, "which in the end is the only authority that matters." Weiss chuckled softly. "Or you English are sentimental about such things." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, "we are practical. You buried a reservoir of refrigerant beneath that window to regulate your device. You bound your clock to Simon Hargreaves through an acoustic mechanical coupling disguised as his own work. You intended to observe how a living rhythm might be manipulated to correct temporal drift. And you returned tonight because the mechanism stopped responding." Weiss inclined his head slightly. "An elegant summary." "The police are already on their way," Holmes went on. "I sent a message before we came downstairs." Weiss's eyes narrowed for the first time. "You said you would bring no police." "I said I had brought none," Holmes replied. "There is a difference." For a moment it seemed Weiss might attempt flight, but then his shoulders relaxed. "It scarcely matters," he said. "The work exists. Others will pursue it." "Perhaps," said Holmes, "but not with Simon Hargreaves as their fulcrum." When Lestrade arrived, breathless and incredulous, the matter was swiftly concluded. Weiss offered no resistance, only a detached curiosity, as though already dissecting his own failure. In the days that followed, the house in Cedar Lane regained its ordinary aspect. The study was cleared, the broken clock removed, and the garden restored. Simon recovered slowly but steadily, his hands once more steady enough to hold a watchmaker's tools. He spoke little of his ordeal, but when he did, it was without hysteria, only a sober respect for the dangers of cleverness unchecked by humility. One evening, some weeks later, Holmes and I sat again in Baker Street, the fire crackling cheerfully, Holmes's violin lying idle upon the table. "You will note, Watson," he said, "that no miracle was required to solve the case, only patience, observation, and a refusal to be impressed by extravagant claims." "And yet," I said, "for a time it truly seemed as though time itself had been tampered with." Holmes smiled and picked up his violin. "Time," he said, drawing the bow lightly across the strings, "is remarkably resilient. It is people who break,